afternoon and welcome to BizTech's Asian Midday Market Watch. It's February the 19th and our guest today is Vishnu Varathan, Head of Economics and Strategy at Mizuho Bank, coming to us out of Singapore. Vishnu, it's always great to have you on the show.
Thanks for having me, Brian. As always, it is my pleasure to be starting the week with you.
Now, Vishnu, with the start of the week, we had we are all guns blazing again in Asia as China has reopened. And to start off, yesterday, the Bank of China left key policy rates unchanged. We've had Indonesian elections that have happened. Walk us through what you're looking at as a macro picture and what you're looking at ahead of the week.
Sure, Brian. In terms of looking at the market's view of things, clearly there are some tensions. On one hand, the entire momentum behind the pivot bets, hoping that the Fed will cut sooner and deeper, this has been pushed back, and you can see from the hotter producer price inflation that it was hot on the heels of CPI that was also a little too high and not coming down quickly enough. So this really has knocked back a little bit of the momentum in equity markets, and some of the spillover effects are still being felt or certainly considered in parts of Asia. But at the same time, there is an opposing story here, which is coming from the Lunar New Year break. China is on a good footing. The spending seems to have picked up. And then there's also the sense that, overall, the Chinese economy might be picking up because of fresh stimulus, despite MLF rates not being cut. So the balanced view here is that on one hand, they're keeping the renminbi steady, which is good for Asian currencies, and that feeds into some positivity around hopes for China picking up and lending some tailwinds to the rest of Asia. The caution, though, here has to be that the bar is quite high for stimulus to really get the Chinese economy rolling. And I think that's what markets will be watchful of as China returns back and they assess all the data that's coming in. Let's not forget, later this week, we've got the LPR rates, which is the main policy rates. I think the views are divided. Some expect a cut, some don't, but there may be some implication and trade-off with the renminbi as well. So that's something they're watching for. Indonesia, I think markets are digesting the fact that, it's pretty much a done deal. It's all but confirmed. So Prabowo has taken the race in the three-way fight, along with Jokowi's son as his vice president. I think there's a lot of relief factor in the market around two things. One is that they will avert a situation of prolonged political uncertainty or election uncertainty because they won't go into round two that typically stretches into and through June. So there's clarity earlier. There's also a sense that Prabowo is the continuity candidate, so to speak, for Jokowi's policy. So that also gives a little bit of optimism to markets. What needs to be watched is on the fiscal front, whether the increased spending desire is matched by the ability to collect revenues. For now, the rupiah is supported. So this week, Bank Indonesia is in a comfortable position to hold and talk through the economy. Nevertheless, the background is if the strong dollar persists, then it does still leave things a little less stable than would be the case ideally. So those are some of the factors being watched. This week, the two other things that I think markets will weigh off is, on one hand, we've got the FOMC minutes. So basically, at the January Federal Reserve meeting, what the Fed has said, we'll get some details into the thinking around it, as well as the split of how many people took what kind of views, more hawkish, neutral, dovish. The risk, though, is because of the two hot inflation prints that have followed, a lot of the relevance of the FOMC minutes is lost to the inflation. So the ability for it to spur further rallies is being checked. And in the meantime, Fed speakers have gotten a bit more cautious and they're exercising a lot more restraint on how quickly they could cut. So that's certainly something that markets will be watching. Down under, the RBA also has got its minutes. RBA minutes can lend a little bit of support to the Aussie because I think the Australian Central Bank hasn't taken any policy decision off the table, including rate hikes. But I think effectively markets recognize, look, it's a really high bar for a hike. And the Aussie is probably going to defer to two factors. One is the broader dollar trend and the Federal Reserve, and the other is the China optimism factor.
Now, looking at all of this and what you've described, what are the major thing that worries you from
Well, I think, for us, we continue to be worried about the usual factors like will China put through sufficient stimulus on time as well, because clearly the confidence deficit factor is pretty large, and it's going to take a larger than usual kind of stimulus, larger than what models would usually predict for the current state of the economy. So that's one factor. That's economic. Our biggest factor this year, though, is around two other factors. One is because of the mix of data coming out of the US, including the hot inflation, they may keep rates too high for too long, and that leads to a downturn. That's one. So a policy misstep, so to speak. The other is politics. I think we cannot get away from the fact that 2024, the year of the dragon, is going to be all about politics. You've got the possibility of Trump 2.0 that could potentially prove very disruptive, not just to China, but wider trade partners and supply chain linkages that tends to have a knock-on impact on other parts of Asia. So those are particular factors that we're watching out for very closely amongst a broader backdrop of diminished visibility.
On that note, Vishnu, on that cautionary note, thank you very much for your insights. Thanks for coming on the show.
Thanks for having me, Brian. It's always a pleasure.
We've been speaking to Vishnu Varathan, Head of Economics and Strategy at Mizuho Bank, and this has been BizTech's Asian Midday Market Watch. I'm Brian Fernandez. Check out the show on our website, www.biztech.asia, as well as our syndication partners, TV stations, radio stations, and websites. Thanks a lot for tuning in.